Okay, so good afternoon once again, and sorry for the delay, but these things happen, unfortunately. So let me just start the discussion forum that we call the Europe-Africa Discussion Forum, that is taking place as a side event to the European Conference of African Studies. The event is organized by the Czech Research Network for Global Development and Sustainability, which is a network which was recently established, and it brings together individuals and institutions focused on global development and sustainability, in particular with the focus on the Global South. The partner of this event is ČEZ Group. ČEZ is the largest energy company in the country, and we are very thankful to them to be a partner and to helping us to arrange this event. My name is Tereza Němečková. I'm the head of the African Studies Center at Metropolitan University Prague, and I'm also chairing this Czech Research Network for Global Development and Sustainability. It is my great pleasure that I can be moderator of the event today. So, when it comes to the topic of the discussion, as the climate change intensifies and the global green transition accelerates, Africa actually is becoming a focal point for resourcing of something what we call the critical raw minerals, which are materials essential for production of the green technologies such as the solar panels, lithium batteries, or wind turbines. According to the International Energy Agency, the demand for these materials or minerals such as lithium, cobalt, or graphite is expected to increase by 4 times until 2040 under the current climate pledges. Or it could be even 6 times until the mid of the century if all the countries in the world decide to move to the zero emissions. Africa holds significant reserves of these minerals. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone produces around 70% of the cobalt, the global cobalt. While the countries like Zambia or Zimbabwe are becoming increasingly important suppliers of copper or the lithium to the global market. But unfortunately, all this, what is happening in Africa, is very often associated with violence, with instability, with severe environmental degradation. There are some reported cases when the local communities in those new mining areas are being forcibly displaced, sometimes even without compensation. So there is a key question whether this could be called a green transition, whether we want to call this a green transition, and whether we have the power just to stop all these negative consequences which are associated with what's happening on the ground. And the European Union is one of the global leaders, which has a lot of instruments, specifically the Global Gateway Initiative and many other instruments. And the European Union is actively seeking partners across the region, actually, to secure access to these resources, which on the other hand is just fueling the global competition for these resources across Africa. So we are happy to be here. And the discussion, the main topic of our discussion will be how actually Europe and Africa cooperation can be structured to support mutual climate and development goals while avoiding the extractive models of the past. The key focus will be on the Global Gateway Initiative and the projects like the Lobito Corridor, for example, like large infrastructural projects in South Africa. And we will also try to discuss the issues, what we as the European Union or European partners can do actually to make sure that all these international partnerships or strategic partnerships that we negotiate with the African partners also bring benefits for the local communities while also safeguard the environmental and social standards. So it is my great pleasure to welcome our speakers. So I'll start with Mr. Salvador Franca. If I'm not mistaken, Franca is the correct pronunciation, who is a member of the Cabinet of High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, Mrs. Kaja Kallas. So welcome, and thank you for coming despite of all the difficulties that you experienced today. Then I would like to welcome Mrs. Patience Musuza, who comes originally from Zambia, from the Copperbelt region, and who currently serves as senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute in the Swedish Uppsala. Then I would like to introduce Mrs. Petra Bránova, who is from the Czech Republic, who is a program director for Africa of one of the leading, if not the biggest, NGO in the Czech Republic, which is called People in Need. Then I would like to welcome Mr. Olayinka Ayala, who comes originally from Nigeria, who serves as associate professor at the Leeds Beckett University in the United Kingdom, and also as a climate security expert of the African Union. Then I would like to welcome Mr. Tim Zajons, who comes from Germany, and Tim serves as interim professor at the University of Freiburg, and also a senior research fellow at the Center for International and Comparative Politics at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Mr. George Mudimo, who comes from Zimbabwe, and he serves as researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability in Bonn. So this is where we are. So now I would like to give the floor to our main speaker, Mr. Franca, if you can just deliver some remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. Hello to everyone. I'm sorry I've made you wait. It's 1 hour direct flight, but I have the impression precisely to have traveled to Africa. There was a strike in Brussels. I had to go to Paris, then the plane late, so really sorry to have made you wait. Maybe a few words of presentation on my side. So Salvador in the Franca, it's a pronunciation quite complicated. Portuguese, I've had 17 years career serving in Africa as a Portuguese diplomat and then as an EU diplomat, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity of addressing you here in Prague about African affairs. So I would like maybe to start, because as you know I am replacing my colleague from Cabinet Sikela, but we work hand in hand because actually Commissioner Kallas is Vice President to Commissioner Sikala, and I think it is maybe the first point to say that all of this about critical raw materials and climate change is also about political relations, and so maybe I would like to start by giving you a bit of an encompassing view of the state of our relations. So as you know, we are the European Union, and as European Union we believe that solution is in regionalization, and so our natural counterpart is the African Union. But then of course this does not this implies relations in every day with individual countries. This year is actually we are celebrating the 25 years of partnership with African Union, and it's a date or a year full of symbolism. Then on the other hand, we have also to acknowledge that relations are somehow strained by geopolitical competition, by some shift in the paradigm. There is a fierce competition, a geopolitical competition, very much connected also to natural resources. We as European Union have been subject to disinformation campaigns, which sometimes also go around the business side. And I would say Africa as a continent is more and more assertive on the international arena. There is a request to be treated as equals. It is clear also that the African continent wishes for a louder voice in the international financial governance. And we, the EU, for an example, pushed a lot for membership at the G20. African countries quite often, and Senegal is one of the main, for an example, says that it is somehow unfair that we are the countries where there is the highest return on investment, and then we have the highest credit rate for borrowing money. And this very much related also to natural resources exploitation. It is also clear that our model, our values are not always universally accepted. There are tensions there, and we have to work on our relations. It is public, for an example, but in the United Nations General Assembly. 10 out of 55 countries voted with us in the last resolutions. In that context, we are trying at the European level. As you know, there was a change of mandate of commissioners, of commission, and so we are actively trying to be proactive and to reset relations. We have recently, now in May, organized the ministerial meeting, the first one in 4 years, which gathered 40 ministers from African side, around 20 ministers from European side, a whole day. And it was positive, and it shows that there is still a lot of interest. First, after 4 years, of course, and given this a bit strained state of relations, the success would be measured partially by attendance, and attendance was quite high, very much on the African side. Actually, they were between 35 and 40 out of 47 possible ones, so really a big success. And for an example, 80 to 100 bilaterals between member states on each side, so European countries, African countries. Still, in spite of challenges, Africa is still probably one of the most vibrant continents on Earth, with the youngest population. The average year is 19 years old. The proportion is quite often 70 to 30% on young people. And it's a population whose size will double by 2050. It has immense entrepreneurial potential, abundant natural resources and critical raw materials, which, as the professor said, are very much necessary for our digital green transition here in Europe. Europe remains the world's largest trading bloc and main investor in Africa, the bigger provider of official development aid, with 239 billion euros, and this is 5 times more than China or the US. So Africa and Europe need each other to deliver on their geopolitical priorities and potential, but more than ever, we need to show that Europe remains a credible, reliable, attentive and solid partner, and this is our challenge, especially in the context of some change in the traditional partners. But Africa needs Europe for sure, but we need Africa as well. We need qualified labor force in Europe. It is our interest to invest in vocational training and in education in Africa. In terms of financial envelope, and this is my introduction to the actual subject, the EU cooperation global envelope for the world was 79. As you know, we work in what we call financial framework, so 7 years of programming for 2021 to 2027, so we are still in that framework. The whole world envelope in terms of the institutions was 79 billion euros. If my souvenirs are correct, for Africa around 39. My message here is that it looks huge, but for an example, I told you I was an ambassador in Niger, and it was at the time the 3rd biggest portfolio of cooperation funds in sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, it was only the equivalent to 2% of the budget. My message here is that we have, I think, the opportunity to be in a niche, to kind of have a demonstration of what we can do best, namely on this area of greening, mining, sustainable development. But we don't have, sometimes I think we a bit overestimate the amounts. So, of course, we want to leverage this, and this is the aim of this conversation, with the private sector. We need more and more investment and cooperation with the private sector. And of course, we have our financial institutions, CIB, EBRD, but of course, what we do a lot is to provide guarantees, de-risking the credits, so that it is an investment in a mix of a public-private partnership. Now, maybe a few words on the subjects that we're more focusing here. On critical raw materials and essential resources first. Africa is home to, we estimate, 30% of the global critical raw materials. As the professor said, these critical raw materials are very much necessary for our defense and aerospace, but also batteries, green transition, electric vehicles, energy transmission, and especially materials like lithium, nickel, cobalt, natural graphite and manganese, most of them produced in Africa and with a huge still partly explored potential. Our estimates, and I think Professor Nemekova said something similar, but here I have that our estimates from 2020 shows that the EU demand for lithium will rise about 45 times by 2015 and 3 times for nickel. Some similar numbers will be seen in other continents. This, of course, brings incredible opportunities to resource-rich countries, as the African countries, but it also brings risks and vulnerabilities. It is also a matter for us in Europe to de-risk, to build our strategic autonomy. We have, as you know, a raw material strategy, which basically sets a plan to diversify the sourcing of materials in view of ensuring resilience of the industrial value chains. We want to produce more materials, but also to boost recycling, to establish partnerships with these countries who have critical raw materials. The cooperation model proposed by the EU through these partnerships is quite holistic. We like to say that it's a 360 degrees approach, meaning, and it was what was mentioned here in the introduction, is that we want to maximize the opportunities and mitigate the risks and vulnerabilities. Basically, it's about the ecosystem, the surrounding environment. We want populations to also benefit of the growth of the economy around the critical raw materials. We want to shift or to build a partnership not only on a purely extractive basis, but on a transformational basis. So our partnerships are essentially based on value chains integration through business and investment promotion, cooperation, research, innovation, capacity building and training along the raw material value chains, the reinforcement of environmental, social and governance standards, and the deployment of soft and hard infrastructure for development projects. We work with these partners countries to maximize the value of the mineral endowments and to make use of it to diversify the local economy by developing local beneficiation. Now, one of the problems we face is the lack of infrastructure, and that's why Global Gateway is very much connected to building the proper infrastructure to maximize the economy around critical raw materials. But of course, we need to work also on many fronts, because there are also challenges on legal frameworks and on governance. And to that end, we have celebrated as EU 14 critical raw material partnerships and a memoranda of understanding, how we call it. Those are non-binding instruments. It's a declaration of intentions, but it's also a working plan to work together based on shared values and principles. Now, a few words on climate action. In spite it is faced with economic and geopolitical challenges, this is one of the things we agree with Africa. We all agree, and the African countries, or most of them, feel very much the impact of climate change on their populations. Still, it's not a road without bumps, because, for an example, sometimes the impact of our internal legislation has consequences, and here I'm thinking, for an example, on CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, meaning that because we have standards about carbon and that it implies some cost on our companies, we want that the goods produced elsewhere to enter the European space, that they pay the fair share of carbon emission. We have also the deforestation regulation, meaning that agriculture that is intensive, such as cocoa, coffee, for an example, and implies deforestation, has also to pay compensation. Problem in Africa, sometimes we are criticized because we are basically seen as burdensome and making life more difficult for small producers. It is not also a secret that we are criticized, for an example, because we are seen as recarbonizing and imposing our standards elsewhere. So this is something that we have to fight. There are issues of communication. It is a battle of the narratives on which we are working. There will be soon enough a second Africa Climate on Summit, which is something where we can discuss these issues. And so maybe just some examples of Global Gateway to make it more lively of what we do. We spoke a lot about Zambia, for an example. There is a project, I'm sorry I brought photos, but I arrived too late to put them online. But we have the Kariba Dam, for an example, in Zambia, which is a huge dam built in 1958 that was about to crack. And so it was a huge project of close to 300 million, on which we financed more than 100 million as European Union, and which allows basically to provide 1/3 of the Zambian needs for electricity, but also half of the Zimbabwe grid is fed by this Kariba Dam. And this goes hand to hand with an interconnector, which is a huge program around the same amounts, if my souvenirs are correct. But this dam is finished. It's one of the Global Gateway flagships that is finished, and so providing clean, renewable energy, either for the populations, but also for business. And an interconnector to Tanzania of the electricity grid, so crossing almost the whole Southern Africa, bringing this electricity multi-country, so regional integration again. It is of course a partnership with the IB and other financial institutions and even the UK. Now a few words on Global Gateway and the Lobito Corridor. The Global Gateway is our instrument for the EU's bilateral cooperation, and it's aimed at mobilizing 150 billion euros of investments by 2027. It is, and it is widely known, our response or our offer compared to the Chinese Belt Road Initiative. It is about trusted and sustainable connections. It helps to tackle the most pressing global issues, from fighting climate change to improving global health systems and boosting competitiveness and security of global supply chains. In the words of President von der Leyen of the Commission, we will support smart investments in quality infrastructure, respecting the highest social and environmental standards in line with the EU's values and standards. Global Gateway strategy is a template for how Europe can build more resilient connections with the world. Now, it is also about promoting our interests. And we are evolving. Global Gateway started to be mainly about infrastructure. Now, more and more, we want, as I said in the beginning, to bring the private sector along. We have basically to find an area where our interests and our partners match, but also the know-how of our companies. And so, more and more, we need to mobilize the private sector, and we do that with organization of business forums, of business contacts, but also that private sector helps us to draw the projects that are more fit. This is a way to show what we have best as companies in Europe, what we can do best, as I said in the beginning, in the niche area. But it is also a way for our companies to learn how to do abroad. This is at least how we see it. The key component of Global Gateway in Africa are the investments on these 12 priority corridors to boost sustainable growth and development around connectivity infrastructure. But just to be clear, this is not about building the whole infrastructure. It's a bit what I was telling you at the beginning. The means are scarce. So it's about the whole ecosystem around these corridors, which does not mean that we won't do some infrastructure or renovate some infrastructure. So the Lobito Corridor is basically the project of a railway connecting DRC, Zambia, and and the port of Lobito in Luanda, and which is an area very rich in several of these critical raw materials that we spoke about. But it is also about transportation costs, about regional integration, about basically vocational training for the populations that will work there. And promoting, of course, diversification of skills and trade facilitation. the progress is quite noticeable in the Greenfield Railway project. So depending on the countries, the railway is different. For an example, in DRC and Luanda, we are, or the plan is to rehabilitate the railway structure. In Zambia, we want to build it from scratch, but we also are realistic and we know that we have to deliver, so there will be a road built in between while we will work on the project of the railway. The member states also, it's an important message. For example, the Lobito corridor is quite significant because it's a partnership with EU, it's member states who also contribute, but even the US. So it's really a project that is of interest to all the stakeholders and investors. The contributions of the member states in the Lobito corridor are estimated around 1.5 billion in terms of Team Europe, so of joint effort. Now, just a few last words on making it a bit more concrete. For the Lobito corridor, for an example, the railway on the side of Angola was built by the Chinese on concessional loans. But then the management of the line, it was a European consortium who won it. And one of the arguments was precisely that we came with a sustainable offer, with training, with added value for the populations. And so this, in a way, shows that the model is starting to work. But also, and this would be my last words, Global Gateway is a vision, and we started recently, and some of these projects are to build in 10 years. So it takes a lot of diplomacy, it takes a lot of explaining, it takes a lot of advocacy, and it takes a lot of fighting against disinformation. So there are still efforts of communication to be done. Of course, we have also some limitations that we can only set the ground for the private sector. So we hope that we will be followed by the private sector. We are working on this in terms of global gateways. Ministries are more and more pushed by us, trying to organize themselves in terms of national clusters for global gateway in the national ministries in order to do this connection with the private sector and the national actors. I will leave it at here for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And before I open the floor for the discussion, I would like to ask our panelists, maybe one by one, if you can introduce yourself a little bit from the perspective of the area of your research or expertise, and if you can make some comments or introductory remarks on the topic. So maybe I'll start with the ladies, if you don't mind.
All right. Yes, thank you, Salvador, Franca, actually, for an introduction. So I'm Patience Mususa, and I'm an anthropologist with an architecture background, and I've been conducting research on the Zambian Copper Belt for the last decade and a half. And my interest actually is around the planning of industrial ecosystems, so boom, bust, urbanization dynamics around settlement. And more recently, given the kind of strategic nature of critical minerals and mining in particular within this specific region, the Zambian Copper Belt abutting the DRC, the interest has been to look at what are the kind of grounded dimensions of this global interest and looking at what actors are doing on the ground. And so we had a presentation yesterday in a panel forum, and one of the entry points to kind of, in particular with the Lobito Railway and in particular the EU Global Gateway investment is who's missing and who's not included in the conversation. So I spent a couple of weeks interviewing municipal planners, spatial planners, socioeconomic planners, environmental officers on the Zambian Copper Belt towns. And it was really quite illuminating from their perspective in terms of what potential possibilities they lie across these particular corridors, and how the particular contextual issues they identified might inform the various partnerships that are emerging. Because just to give a bit of context, Zambia is one of the countries that has a memorandum of understanding with the EU, but at the same time it's also in discussion with various agreements with Japan, a comprehensive strategic partnership with China, and it's multiple actors, and its approach is very much working within a multilateral but also pluralistic approach to investment. And so the question then in the dimension is that, given also the particular histories for the region, with the history of extraction, with mining having been established around the extraction of minerals, what can the EU do differently today around planned infrastructures that allay the concerns around an extractive economy? And the perspective of planners, for example, we talked a little bit about the missing gap between EU global policymaking and national actors, but also within the kind of regional context within which investments are to occur, and the technocrats that are involved and would be involved in the planning processes in these ecosystems. So land allocation, changing of land use zone, addressing environmental, social standards, but also long-term investment in education and social services, the things that municipalities do. So one thing that came up consistently across all sectors was thinking about economies outside of mining as key opportunities, and agriculture is one of them that got mentioned, but also that the rail projects, be it the Lobito, the Tazara project, are actually also seen as part of a broader regional integration effort to intersect these countries' economies and actually address the key logistical challenges that these towns in the region are facing with huge bulk transportation of commodities. So when you read the international press speaking a little bit about, you know, the kind of broader narratives that occur, all the municipalities want bulk transportation of commodities occurring on rail because of the environmental risks and the huge costs involved in road maintenance. So that's key. They also want a much more integrated economy to intersect with the livelihoods that occur outside the mining sector. Mining catalyzes new economic opportunities, but it's not the primary employer of most people. They're employed in a variety of sectors. And then there's also the kind of key from a national contextual context. All the countries want to move up the value chain, and that requires investment in research and innovation and development. And one of the key areas that comes up, both from academic institutions within the region, but also emerge from a planner's perspective, is that they would like to build up the educational ecosystem. And linking in that the large part of the discussions from an EU level have focused very much on business and trade, but and then there's always a kind of dimension around relations of trust around that. How do you create a trustful context that allows investments at different scales? And at the same time, you have an absence of the infrastructure such as educational exchange, the setting up of knowledge hubs, innovating together for infrastructure, urbanization dynamics, and renewable energy within the context that make the co-production of new, green tech possible. So there's significant scope, I would argue, for partnership, but there's a little bit of a disconnect between the kind of, and I expected, between the kind of EU level global multilateral framework, national politics, but also the dimensions of creating and building a sustainable industrial ecosystem around these particular projects.
Okay, thank you. So maybe I'll ask, do we want to reflect on it now? Or we will do it afterwards? Okay.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Petra Vranova and I work as the Regional Director for Africa for People in Need. People in Need is an organization that was established in Czech Republic more than 30 years ago. And we work now in more than 40 countries around the world. Our annual budget is around 200 million euros and every year we reach 4 million people, just to give a picture. But in Africa, apart from other countries, we are one of the few European organizations that is operational and is working alongside local actors in all 3 countries of Lobito Corridor, Zambia, Angola and Congo. And so that's sort of the contribution that I'd like to have today, which is grounded on our experience working and be operational in these countries. And that allows us not only to bring that operational experience, but also we try to use opportunities like this to amplify the voices of the communities with whom we work in these countries, and to make sure that their expectations and feedback is being heard, even in high-level decision-making tables. And because they keep reminding us that the Global Gateway Initiative and the Lobito Corridor investment has a great potential, it's raising many expectations. It's amazing on what values it's being based, especially when we look at the 360 approach, which is basically guaranteeing to give like 10% of the investments also for the human development, which is great. But there are also still risks that it might become new form of extractivism rather than shared pathway to inclusive development. So today I'd like to share a few learnings that we have from our programming in these countries and from the assessments that we are doing more as like implementing organization. And from our perspective, for this investment to be sustainable and lasting, we need to make sure that it's inclusive, especially focusing on youth, unlocking the potential of youth. In Africa, every year, 10 to 12 million youth are entering labor market, but currently there are jobs offered only for 3 million of them. Youth in Africa are the future power. So they have a great potential in terms of business growth, economic development, which must be linked with skills development and value chain analysis and building the businesses, not just in mining, but also agriculture and other sectors that the opportunities are definitely there and the interest as well. But youth are not only the workforce, but they can be also like the generational accountability voice, because they are representing, they have ideas, they don't see only what is there, but also what's possible. And they can help to make sure that the investments are long-term, accountably managed. And this goes along with inclusion of civil society organizations and other actors. We can see that it's actually a result of OECD and DAC assessment, which was saying that if the civil society organizations are included from the beginning of this design of the investments, it's up to 50% more likely that it will be successful and long-term with a positive social impact. But we can see that when the investments are planned, civil society organizations are not always included as co-creators, but then it's very difficult to make sure that the acceptance at the local level, that the inclusiveness is secured and that the voice of the communities is being heard. So those would be the 2 main points that from our side, from the programming perspective, we would feel like focusing on youth, inclusion of civil society, but I cannot leave out the environmental protection. We as an organization, our main strategic pillars are humanitarian response, civil society and inclusive governance, but also climate resilience building. In all the 3 countries, that's something that we try to work on a lot. And we believe that these investments should be linked or based on environmental and social impact assessments and have some community-led monitoring mechanisms that will help to make sure that they are lasting and saving the natural heritage that's in these countries. So that's in short. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So maybe George, you want to take it up?
Oh, sure. Chair, thank you. My name is George. My primary research is on land politics, social reproduction, and agrarian questions. So some quick reflections. The most important thing is that about 800 million people in Africa live in rural areas and they survive on the land. In addition, Africa loses about 7 billion per year to climate change. So climate change is a reality, and it's a reality which means we have to do mitigation and adaptation. So the EU comes in terms of mitigation and adaptation through various ways, but these ways impact on the land issue, which is my area of focus. But before that, it's commendable that the Gateway project has spent about 810 million on the Kariba Dam, which is really good for Africa's development. And it has also brought an opportunity for people to really think about alternatives. But what then happens with EU policies on mitigation and adaptation? First, a number of formats are introduced. These include all of the approaches are land-based, be they corridors, wind farms, solar farms, they all go on the land. So considering that more than 50% of people live on the land, then a number of questions arise. The first thing is that these investments are put on the land, and common narratives are put in place such that, for example, people's way of livelihood is said is unsustainable. We have got pastoralists, people who survive on farming from one place to another. Then new narratives are put in place that this is unsustainable. And sometimes where people do agricultural production at household level, then it's put across that this is not efficient. Then these models are then sometimes imposed in most cases. Promises of jobs are made, but usually some of these jobs, when the projects are put in place, say that they are temporary jobs, or the people are then told you are not skilled enough, after losing their land. So these are some of the serious concerns. So what then happens is that some of these people are displaced, some of them cannot escape poverty. Then issues of these minerals, most of them are not processed locally. Then what then people do is to see what I can call fictitious development. They know the road, they see the road, but they don't know where the road is going. So these are some of the concerns from the people, that what they need is not like people don't hate development. This is wrong. African people will have development. That's why we did anti-colonial struggles. But what we are worried about, especially concerning the land, are the terms of incorporation into those projects. So what would be more sustainable would be to improve the terms of incorporation, especially around land access, land control and ownership. And because what you see with these big projects is that number one, they lead to land consolidation and commodification of land. In those areas where these projects are put, usually local people are expropriated the land, it's either by the state or by the corporates, but usually the state is the issue. So what local people would want is to be incorporated on mutually, just terms into those projects, and also to make sure that they keep, having control over their land. And in other ways, where those projects are not suitable, it's better to leave them, because some of these projects result in social engineering, introducing value chains sometimes which have nothing to do with the local people. So what is more important is to respect people's land rights, especially indigenous people, and also not to do what I can call air pegging. We see from the air, we see they are not productive. Yet land, when you go to the countryside, land is different meanings to people. Sometimes it's a place of worship. Sometimes it's a place of just staying. Who says you have to produce every day or maize? So the idea there is we need a grounded approach, especially with understanding of land rights. And it's good to hear that the Global Gateway is a competition between China and the EU. So we hope when there's competition, we get whoever is on favorable terms. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have Tim now.
Thank you, Tim Sions. I work in the field of international relations and global political economy, and I think this is also the perspective I would like to add here, because my previous speakers, they are much better positions and have already given insight on the impact of communities across the African continent. I would like to add a little bit on the meta context, if you want, of these changes in EU-Africa relations, be it the Global Gateway Initiative, be it these partnerships that Ambassador Franca has mentioned with regard to so-called critical minerals. I believe the challenge and the two meta contexts, if you wish, are on the one hand side, obviously, climate change, which is arguably the meta context, which is the biggest challenge for the Anthropocene that we have arguably faced so far. The other meta context in which we need to see the current changes of Africa-EU relations is what Mr. Franca has already mentioned as well, is a intensifying geopolitical and geoeconomic competition, which not least plays out in Africa. Related to this, and this is something that Patience has also mentioned with regard to Zambia, obviously African governments and economies have over the last 20-30 years also systematically diversified their external partnerships. Obviously China is mentioned very often in this context, and I believe, and this is what I learned from research I've done in Brussels with senior decision makers there, from the Parliament, from the Commission, also from the European External Action Service, but also on the implementing side of things with diplomats in Africa, European diplomats in Africa, this China factor, if you want to call it like that, in the formulation of the Global Gateway Initiative, and with regard to the critical minerals foreign policy of the EU, I think this China factor cannot be overestimated actually. It's very key. While scholars still disagree on whether we are leaving neoliberal globalization behind, that's a discussion we won't resolve today, but quite certainly we are seeing an emergence of strong geopolitical, geoeconomic competition, and China plays a major role, particularly in the context of various transnational networks, be it infrastructure, be it various production networks such as electric vehicles, battery value chains, which of course are related to so-called critical minerals, for instance. So this competition has affected the formulation of the Global Gateway Initiative very much. I remember the Commission President, when she mentioned the Global Gateway Initiative for the first time in her State of the Union address in 2021, she called that example saying, we meaning the European Union, we are very good in building roads to connect Chinese-owned mines with Chinese-operated ports, but that this is obviously not in the interest of the European Union. Now, what we are seeing here is quite clearly a geopolitization of development cooperation, and one must also say, obviously Mr. Franca is responsible for the official narrative. If you dig a little bit deeper in Brussels, but also in the European delegations across the continent, there have been quite a few controversies around this geostrategic reorientation of the EU's foreign policy, particularly also with regard to critical minerals, with regard to infrastructure. We have had, particularly within INTPA, for instance, the department in Brussels, which is responsible for international relations or partnerships. There have obviously been protagonists which didn't quite like, again, this geopolitization of development cooperation. This is an internal challenge within the EU. On the other hand side, what I experience when I talk to decision makers in African capitals is very interesting. Several of them said to me, Tim, it's actually quite refreshing, because for the very first time the EU is pretty open and blunt about their interests. So here I think there is a new discourse around it. The EU is again very open, that it is interested, for instance, in critical minerals. And now I think the question remains to what extent this these partnerships can be sustainable in the long run, and that relates obviously to the question of whether we are experiencing a new form of extractivism here, or whether actually value addition happens in African economies. I think I'll leave it here for now and pass the microphone to the professor.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Kaja. I wear 3 caps. So the first one is I'm a lecturer of politics and international relations at Beckett University in the UK. And then the second one, I work as a consultant for the African Union in developing a common African position on climate change, peace and security in Africa. So we're rounding up that. And then the third one, this something that started recently. So 2 months ago, I was invited by the government of South Africa to advise on what should be some of the position of the African Union as part of South African G20 presidency this year. So, and I was given a task of moderating the panel on youth inclusion. And when we at the panel, there was no youth on that panel. And all the youth came to me after and they said, you need to be our youth champion. So if anything is happening, you need to be able to speak on what are the issues that relate to us. So since then, I've been working with a lot of youth groups across Africa. So I'm going to bring together all these 3 in the next few minutes, just talk about some of the issues that we are working on and the challenges we're facing. On the issues of climate change, peace and security in Africa, we all know that Africa produce less than 5% of the global CO2 emissions, but the continent is disproportionately impacted by the impact of climate change. And this is increasingly resulting in localized conflict, terrorism, and climate change is moving away from a threat multiplier to becoming a threat to the continent itself. And if Africa is going to be able to achieve Agenda 2063, which is this is the long-term 50-year agenda of the African Union, the Africa we want, we need to deal with the issues of climate change. We need to deal with the issues of youth inclusion. We need to deal with the issue of conflict, insecurity, democracy, and fragility impacting on the continent. The EU is an important partner of African countries, of the African Union, but there are several gaps which have been identified in the relationship between the African Union, African countries, and the EU. And I just want to highlight some of those gaps, and hopefully Mr. Franca can talk about some of it, how the EU is working towards addressing some of these gaps. So for us to be able to build a fair and forward-looking EU-African green transition partnership, some of the gaps identified already includes the uneven power dynamics, an unequal distribution of benefits between the AU and the EU. So we both know that whether we like it or not, we are still not equal partners. Yes, we try to portray this in so many fora, but there is still a gap in that. And then the other one is the issue of funding insufficient financial and technical support. I'm happy you mentioned the issue of funding earlier, which is a big problem. When we were in Pretoria, when we're talking about the issue of funding and the percentage African countries pay for Eurobonds and for borrowing when compared to what Germany or other European country pays for the same funding, it's enormous. There was a particular funding, I can't remember which one, where the interest rate was close to 10% for Ghana, and it was less than 1% for Germany for the same funding stream. So this is a big problem. Africa is a land of opportunities, a high return of investment. What is happening with this borrowing cost and financial technical support? And there's also the issues of geopolitical tensions and policy divergence. I think in the last 3 years, we've seen a lot of issues regarding the war in Ukraine and the perspectives African countries have taken. I wrote an article explaining why some of the African countries remain neutral when the first UN vote was came up, and I got a lot of stick for it because they felt if you try to be objective, then you are not supporting the European cause. But again, so it shows that sometimes when someone is trying to be objective, use fact, you need to be looking at things in a particular way, and this creates problem for scholars and people working in Africa. And then there's the issues of lack of local ownership and capacity building. The issues of youth and civil societies. I'm so happy when Petra talked about these two issues, especially the issue of youth inclusion. The average age of young people in Africa is about 19.3 years, and the average age of our leaders is 63 years. So there is a big gap between the leadership and the followership. And the EU, being strategic partner of African countries, and has a significant role to play in terms of youth inclusion. And then finally, the issue of civil societies in Africa. Interestingly, I am organizing a workshop in Abuja next month, looking at the role of civil societies on the climate change, peace and security discourse in Africa. I just got an email this morning that the director of civil societies in Africa is coming in person, so I'm really happy about that. But these are the issues where we need direct input from the EU in order to be able to address some of the key challenges on green energy transition. We don't want this to be business as usual. We also what happened during the first spate of extraction, the oil and gas extraction, and how this led to devastation in communities, countries, and conflicts around the continent. What are we going to do differently with the green energy transition? Is it going to be the same thing, or are we going to do things differently to make sure that the youth, the vulnerable people, and the communities that are suffering the impact of climate change benefit from this new phase of green energy transition? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will open the discussion now. We raised so many issues here, from the geopolitical situation, from the point of view of the local communities, all the problems on the ground, including the land distribution, land displacement, how to involve actually the youth on the ground. But we started the discussion from the point of view of the strategic partnerships that the EU is trying to negotiate with the African states. So maybe before I give the floor to the audience, let's just try to wrap it up, what was said here. So if we should focus on these strategic partnerships that the EU is trying to negotiate with the African states, I think we should, or we could admit that most of the issues that have been discussed here are within the competence of the national governments, of the central governments of those particular African states. But as an external actor, the EU, when you negotiate, for example, the partnerships with the African states, to what extent you also pay attention to the issues that have been raised here, the involvement of the youth, the environmental degradation, the land disposition, and all these issues that actually are very often being criticized, that are somehow overlooked from this top level.
Thank you. So yeah, from the beginning I want to say a lot of provocative things, but I can't. And Tim pushed me on that and cornered me, but staying the closest I can to the on local communities. Look, nobody, and that's part of my message, nobody is perfect, and we are far from it, but at least I would say we tried. For an example, we were speaking of Zambia. This has been 4 years. We have actually funded around those projects of mining, but which is inherited from what we used to do before. Paralegals that are of assistance to those communities in local language to explain what's happening, what they can do, and even support them in legal actions. So basically we are even funding people to work against us. I'm not saying that we are perfect, but that effort is done. Somebody, I don't know, I think it was you, said that we are creating temporary jobs that will not be that useful whenever it is extracted. Well, first, I don't know how long it will last for, whatever, because the mining, as you know, I remember when I was a kid, I was 10, I heard in school, well, oil, we have reserves for 20 years, and now I think we have some extra 20 and some 30 past since then. So it's not, I think, that linear. And then, anyway, we don't do only this. What we want is actually to have a more qualified labor force for the needs. It's something we need, and it's something that responds to jobs as well. We had that in Europe, the industrial, Belgium, where I come from now, the north of Belgium and France was the industrial zone and never really reconverted. So of course we learned from that, but it's also, for an example, what one could say has happened in other experiences like Côte d'Ivoire, where people shifted to cocoa, and it was not cocoa at the beginning, but then in the end it's an economy that is still working. In terms of transformation, it's again incipient, but this training we are trying to give is, for an example, we were speaking of the copper, to build the whole plug. It's a start, it's something, but again, we have to start somewhere. We are also working a lot on residues of mining, to recycle them, especially the extraction of copper. Now, youth, for me, youth is it's not a problem, but one of the, and here I'll be a bit provocative, but one of the unaddressed issues, it's a bit maybe less pronounced in the southern part of Africa, but it's somewhere. The one taboo is demography, that we never address. Because, for example, in Niger, where I was posted, it was the highest birth rate of the world, close to from somewhere between 7 and 8 children per woman. And so even to grow the economy has to develop, I prefer not even to say the numbers, the projected numbers of growth, of economic growth you would need for that. But as partners, it's something that we have always been told that this is an issue we don't want to speak about. And again, I think that as a partner, and this was my message at the beginning, I think we can try to show what we can do best there and to test if it's useful. And I've seen, for an example, now maybe not speaking of mining, but solar plant. This was actually replicated, where we did one, they then partnered up with other people saying that, okay, this is useful, we actually need this. So we can show whatever we can do best to see if it fits or not. This is how I see partnership. It's a sharing of experience, because our companies also actually learn working in these countries. But we cannot really impose a model. About youth. The problem, and it's connected to demography, is that not only the market has issues absorbing all that youth coming in, but even the school system, if you want. So there is, it's not a secret, deficit in terms of schooling. And so for me, but this we cannot, I told you, I insisted on also saying the numbers, the big numbers of what we can do. We cannot, neither the partners want actually to replace the state in education, and we don't have any way even close to enough to cover the whole education system. So my problem basically is that you have some youth that is probably did not have education to a stage enough to actually contest in what we are doing. And the thing is that this youth, we talk with civil society, but the problem is that I would say the share of the youth that we have speaking with us is the ones from the system. It's the ones that basically want one day to be probably in this panel. What is hard to have is probably that youth that is a bit more excluded and whose share is huge, or at least consequent in Africa. Then about civil society, And deeds, somebody spoke of land property. Again, not overdo our size, because we do it here and there, but I can't say that at the scale of our intervention, looking at the scale of a country, it's something huge, I'd say. So, of course, there are problems here and there, but I know for having not directly managed but signed projects, that there is months, and actually it's always I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit defensive, but it's always the dichotomy or the paradox between we are accused of being slow and burdensome, and part of it is because we actually do a lot of verifications of how that land was acquired, to who it was acquired, to make sure that the state replies, to make sure that we consult the communities. So I'm not saying at all that we are perfect, but again, our competitors probably are less burdensome and quicker to do, and we lose on the battle of narratives because we do that effort. Again, not at all saying that we are perfect in it. I don't know, I don't know if I forgot. Yeah, again, about the populations, not to forget, as EU, we have, of course, this kind of development to cooperation, which is shifting to a business model, if you want, or getting closer to a business model. We still have some classical cooperation. We also have humanitarian, and probably we are one of the only keeping that triptych. Now, just one last reaction to something more on the foreign policy side. This is very clear. All of our partners basically tell us, okay, stop the narrative of altruistic aid, put forward your interests, which we did, as Tim said, and in the end, our interests are, I think, quite clear. It depends a bit on the area of geography, but very honestly, also, most of our partners tell us we don't want any more cooperation like you've done for the last 40 years. We want business, we want investment. Now, investment, the problem with companies, as I said, is we want to involve them, but we can just set the framework. Our business sector is very independent, sometimes conservative, so we have to set the framework and to create the people-to-people contact. But we can't just oblige them to go here or there. But this kind of public-private partnerships and this niche model of pushing companies there, of also showcasing our production, I think it's one of the best things we can do. So I don't know, I'm sorry, I reacted. It was a bit longer, less noted.
Thank you. Thank you. So I don't know if any of the panelists want to pick up on this, but maybe the question would be, like I asked you, but from your point of view, the strategic partnerships between EU and the African states, or the states that you are coming from, particularly maybe Zambia, because Zambia already has the deal signed. What is missing there? What do you think could be improved, actually? And second question, that could be perhaps more on our African partners here, because there was a criticism raised against the Global Gateway Initiative, that it's a little bit responsive to what China has been doing in Africa over the last few years. So maybe could you reflect from your point of view how this Global Gateway is viewed or perceived in your countries, in comparison to what China is bringing actually to your countries? So what kind of like benefits or disadvantages you see there?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. When the coup happened in Niger 2 years ago, I saw a caption that really fascinated me, and I wrote about it. So someone held, when the young people were supporting the genocide one way or the other, there was a caption and they put, "What has China done for Africa, and what has the EU, France, and the US done for Africa?" And with the Chinese part, they built this, they built that, they built this road, they built that. And then with the France one and the EU, they talked about military bases. So there is the issue of narrative, which you mentioned now. Because yes, we understand the fact that The EU does a lot in terms of budget support and some other forms of things that are not really visible on ground. If you go to Abuja, Abuja is the capital of Nigeria, for instance. All the street lights in the big metropolis, you will see the big caption, funded in support with the Chinese, blah, 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 blah. So people see a lot of these little infrastructures, Russia, China, and this creates a narrative that these are the partners. So that is the first issue in terms of the issue of narratives. How would the EU be able to show that, yeah, these are the ways in which we are partnering, and these are the things that we have been. There's no doubt that those of us in academia and policy and some other areas, we know, but to the people on the ground, it's only the maternity centers and the things they can see with the huge labels on ground. The second issue, quickly, is there is a gap in terms of companies from the West and how a lot of people on ground feel that they pillage African countries. So for instance, if you look at Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and a lot of countries in the Sahel, there's this narrative that, well, most of the European countries working in these extractive industries are the ones that get the money. So I'll give you an example. For oil and gas in Nigeria, the Nigerian government gets 60% royalty for the oil and gas extracted in Nigeria. Whereas in Niger, before the coup, the government of Niger gets less than 10% royalty. I don't know the exact for the uranium mined in that country. So the young people now are more educated, they are social media savvy. And so the question is, what is the EU putting in place in terms of the green transition to make sure that companies that are investing are giving an equitable share? Yeah, we know that they bring in the machineries, the equipment and all the likes, but again, there needs to be a kind of system whereby the royalties is commensurate, and then the people are able to get what they deal from the extraction of that. Because these are the kind of things that we hear. I do research in these areas, I travel to these regions, and these are the questions that are being asked by civil societies, by community leaders, and we saw that playing out in several parts of the region, especially with the coups and the narratives that the juntas have been able to dish out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe a non-male identifying voice first.
Okay, thank you. I think, all right, okay, I think because I work on land and agriculture, I'll pay specific reference to the EU regulations on deforestation. For example, if you go to Kenya, Tanzania, you see a lot of farmers who grow tea and coffee, and if you look at the EU regulations, deforestation regulations, they're sort of very prohibitive to those farmers. For example, for you to export coffee to Europe, you need to make sure that, and to be certified that it was not, grown in an area which is deforested. You need to send GPS location, then you get the certificates before exporting. This is very cumbersome for local farmers. On the other hand, just last week, I think you are paying attention, China just said, oh, African exports are welcome. Africa export whatever you can, it's welcome to China. So you see, the EU sort of has lots of stringent measures, especially for Africans to enter this market. But on the other hand, if you look at the Lobito corridor and other interventions from the EU, they survive on trade liberalization from Africa. They say, oh, remove, taxes, all these things. But when it comes to us to enter Europe, there are a lot of restrictions. So I think in that regard, the EU sort of lags behind, because it is a scissors approach. In Africa, they expect us to remove the import duties, etc. But when it comes to us to export the same things we are producing, where we have our competitive advantage, is sort of challenging, especially the EU regulations. I know they've been suspended for a year because of some agitation from civil society, but I think what could be done beforehand is to have lots of wider consultation, especially with progressive farmer groups. Farmer groups are different. There are some which sort of lip-sync what the EU wants, then there are other progressive, land movements like the Lavia Kamasina. So I think the EU can pay attention to sort of bottom reactions from the bottom. Thank you.
I know it was a question more for African colleagues, but just on the lighter note, like we had a number of semi-formal discussions with our CSO colleagues in Africa and with the people we work with. And I mean, frankly, we are a European NGO, so we care about what our colleagues in Africa think about European investment. And as an implementers, we can see that EU is still the donor that cares about the values, about inclusiveness, and that there is, like, if you look at the worldwide funding portfolio, I don't know how much you are informed, but about the US cuts that affected everything, the other donors are announcing cuts, EU is still there and still being stable. So it's observed as a trustful donor and partner, but still China is there as this elephant in the room coming with some solutions. So we kept asking the local civil society organizations and others, so what's the difference? Where do you see the added value of EU? Like, how do you decide? And they were saying that, on the lighter note, that for them China is like GPS. It's very fast, direct, and will take you there no matter what, if the road is there or not. Whereas EU is more like a compass, yeah? Principled, reliable, pointing north even in the storms, yeah? So, could be really trusted partner in the green transition. But sometimes if the compass could be with motor, like a bit faster, that would be great. So just wanted to share that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, I think one of the core things that I think that could be done a lot better, especially around the discussions around critical minerals, infrastructure and the like, is also really intersecting with Africa policymakers at a continental level working on these areas. It's oftentimes quite striking when I speak to EU policymakers on the continent and also here in Europe, who tend to dismiss the coordination work that the African Minerals Development Center associated with the African Union and what they're doing, or within the kind of Southern African region, the Southern African Development Community development strategies, both on industrialization, but also on the development of transport corridors. And I think this is really key because I think, the key thing about partnerships, right, and relationships that started off on a bad footing, and the EU-Africa relationship has a historical difficulty that looms large, even though it's never really kind of explicitly stated fully, but it looms large. So there's almost a kind of, we're connected, there's this historical, legislative, legal frameworks that these countries, many of them already have, but the question is, how do you reframe that to, in a sense, take the space and take the lead from the discussion? So the issue of affordable finance. The key issue that is oftentimes raised within industrialization policy, that the concerns in particular after the COVID-19 pandemic, right, about being able to have security to access to medication, personal protective gear, was a real political shock in capitals that has really, really animated industrialization and value addition agendas, and to onshore some of that capacity. So oftentimes when there's also a China discussion, there's the imagining that there isn't a critical lens that's cast on Africa-China relations from Africa policymakers and capitals. African countries would like to have some of that capacity for refining, processing battery packs on the continent, and are working on diplomacy and leveraging actually the EU, US, Japan partnerships to try and onshore that for renewable energy storage, given, for example, urbanization dynamics, the growth of these economic sectors that many young people are engaged in, agriculture and trade. So they're really trying to kind of leverage it. So that pluralistic approach is very much that they would also want partners that ally with them in their interests. And I think the EU should increasingly look at their role as an ally to African interests to build up and develop that capacity. Now, how does that potentially happen to be able to build trust, right? And there's very, very sadly a nationalistic current in Europe that I think it's Europe's domestic politics that's creating a hamper to real engagement with African partners because of the anti-migration rhetoric, which says, we want to partner with you, but please don't come here. And so then it creates also an elite narrative of Africa policymakers at a higher level being able to intersect, but not really allowing the possibilities for cooperation and relationships for knowledge producers, small traders wanting to figure out and learn with, in particular, for example, in Southern Europe, around agricultural value chains. So there's real scope, but there's also a need to kind of acknowledge that some of the hard work actually needs to happen, and a little bit more boldness within kind of EU technocratic circles in being able to communicate to European capitals and politicians about the interdependent relationships that actually Africa and the EU have, and why it's important to shift that. Because when I hear, oh, China as that kind of big bogeyman in the room, right? Actually, it's not really China. It's Europe's domestic politics that's creating a hamper to a large extent in this kind of broader narratives from European political capitals that are creating a hamper to building trust and relationships to make actually things move further.
You want to?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll try to stay briefly, but it actually links very, very nicely to what Patience already alluded to. I think, to be clear about these strategic, or the reorientation of Africa-China relations, I think there is potential, but there's also huge risk that it fails in the sense. I mean, what it actually needs is a fundamental acknowledgement on the European side also of why historical relations have gone wrong. And I think the African side expects, we have had partnership talk for decades. I think the African side expects to deliver on actual partnership, and that implies that we as Europeans meet African counterparts at eye level, and I think even from a European perspective, it's high time to do so, because we are realizing that it is actually interdependence. It's no longer that we can direct political and economic developments on the African continent as we did for several centuries. We need to be very honest about, I mean, in academic terms, we discuss this as the coloniality of power. We need to deconstruct it in a sense, and that goes beyond progressive talk in the context of Global Gateway or in the context of other initiatives. It means that we actually invite African counterparts, be they decision makers, be they civil society actors, actually invite them to join us in an economic transformation towards net zero, for instance. But that means that from the outset, African partners need to be involved, and you mentioned Patience already. I spoke to people in Addis Ababa, and I double-checked them with people in Brussels who were involved in designing these 11 strategic corridors, which are now 12 with Lobito, I suppose. And both sides actually confirmed, well, we had to come up with some projects because the pressure was very high from von der Leyen's cabinet to basically come up with projects. And then you end up again designing corridor designs which are not, as Patience mentioned already, which are not sufficiently coordinated with African counterparts. And this is when you counteract already your own narrative again. And I think that the African side is rightly very, very sensitive when it comes to these, to such kind of signals, because again, they have choice. They have choice. I spoke to to colleagues of Ambassador recently. I can't name the country, but they say we try to liaise with government in African country, but we are not. We don't longer have this immediate access. There are other actors around, and I think this requires on the European side to become completely and bluntly honest, to reflect again on our historical relationships, and start really set the European African relations on new grounds.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, that was a part of the discussion that we had before, that the geopolitical situation has significantly changed. And we just mentioned here only the EU and China as the key players, but it's not only about these two key players. It's about the US, of course, it's about Canada, it's about Turkey, it's about India, it's about Russia, but it's also about the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia now. So there is more and more actors, actually, Japan, of course, Korea, which are interested in Africa and also in the mining area. So it's true that the situation has become a little bit more difficult from this perspective for the EU, actually. We just started a little bit late, so I think we could allow a few more minutes for the discussion and interaction with the audience. So let's say we have around like 25 minutes. So is there any question? We have a microphone over there, so is there any question that you want to ask?
Thank you very much. My name is Michael. At the RED, the Center for African Conflict and Development based in London. Thank you very much. This is a very exciting panel. I really enjoyed it. Let me start off from, I think it was Tim that said it. I was happy to hear it. And this is something I've been writing over the years. When you talked about, when you asked someone in Africa, I think, and they said the EU is being, I've forgotten how you kind of like paraphrasing, like EU is coming out clean about their interests. So this is what I've been writing over the years, looking at the dynamic interaction between conflict and development, and looking at how, so I've been making the case for strategic interest, for the EU and by extension Western liberal intervention in Africa to shift away from that. One, starting from colonial times, when we talk about civilizing mission, rather it was multi-strat stuff. And then in the last 60 years in Africa, we've seen development interventions based on human rights conditions and good governance, democracy, and stuff like that. So, but what we've seen, similar to what we saw during the Cold War with competitions from Soviet Union that allowed Western nations to permit authoritarian government in Africa. So with the new quote-unquote scramble for Africa, and where China is now dominating, let's say in DRC for instance, China is the hegemon when it comes to the minerals. So in the kind of conversations I've had in Europe, in meetings, we've seen where there is an actual fear among Western nations about China's dominance and the need and the acceptance, like we need to move away from these human rights conditions and to follow a market approach or Chinese approach. So I'm happy to hear similar stuff. But what I want to say is why that shift in ideology, shift in orientation is happening among the EU. Africa seems to be stuck in terms of a dependency paradox. And that would be my own critique from the Africa. So we've seen something like, oh, Chinese is building infrastructure. What is the EU going to do? So I'm happy to hear Salvador says, there's a step, when your comeback, you did mention about some country wanting the EU to build the whole education system. So that is that level of dependency, which I would say we need in Africa needs to change that orientation. And I would say that in parallel to what George said, this could be an approach, one way to do that. So when you gave the example of the disparity or inequality in terms of like importing stuff, and then the tax that is put on things that have been exported out. I think we should move away from saying the EU should do this and do this and do that, things we want to see the Chinese way. Rather, we should engage each other at the policy level and say we want changes in the regulations. We want the EU to be able to not extract the stuff, we want to be able to produce this stuff to this level. We want this level of stuff. That should be how the African government should have agency and leverage to be able to change that in unequal power relations. And lastly, we talked about civil society. Petra mentioned civil society and Yinka also said it. And I'm happy Salvador came back. The comeback was also good. Now, we kind of look at civil society in a positive sense in Africa, but from my own research, civil societies are divided into two, as Salvador rightly mentioned. There are some that are, most of the civil societies are part of the system. So when we say civil society, we need to distinguish between those that are really, they are minority. So if you just having a couple of civil society group does not make any impact if they're working for the government. So we need to be able to discern and know the ones that are really, working for the people rather than the state. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. It was rather a comment than a question, if I understand it well. So is there anyone else who wants to ask something?
Hi, Teresa. My name is Keiko. It's also a comment, but thank you very much for all your very fascinating interventions. I'm Keiko Alvarez, and I'm a policy analyst with the OECD Development Center's Africa desk. By way of background, the center occupies a very unique space in the multilateral architecture. It has a diverse membership of 56 countries, 12 of which are in Africa. And it's an independent platform gathering, OECD, non-OECD, developing, emerging countries, engaging in policy dialogue and knowledge sharing to identify policy options and very actionable solutions. One of the engagement tools that we work related to critical minerals is the equitable framework in finance for extractive-based countries in transition, so EFFECT for short. In a nutshell, EFFECT provides policy options for resource-rich countries aiming for net zero by 2050 to transition away from fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. So EFFECT implementation is supported by an advisory group co-chaired by the EU and Nigeria. We are very thankful to them, and they, so to implement EFFECT in Africa, for example, we rely on the African Development Bank. And one of the cases, the case studies we've looked into is the lithium-ion battery manufacturing as a good example for value chain development and upgrading. So that's a very interesting case study we're looking at. And also I wanted to say, as Mr. Franca alluded to, infrastructure is a very, very important part of this equation. Our new report due to come out in September, at the end of September, estimates that for Africa needs an annual investment of $155 billion annually to get to that infrastructure level needed. Yeah, so we've seen that on average, African countries spend 7 times more, added to all the challenges that you've spoken about. Africa spends 7 times more on debt servicing than on infrastructure. These can reach very, very high levels in places such as Mozambique, that spends 84 times more on debt servicing than on infrastructure, and 51 times in Guinea-Bissau. So it's, and just lastly, there's the shrinking ODA landscape also, our report also, research revealed that only 1% of all of the ODA in 2023 went went to skills. And skill development is a very, very important component of infrastructure, energy, transport, especially. And half of this, less than half of this, goes to women. So this is just to say a few words on what we're doing and what we were interested in, and that we very much look forward to engaging with you all.
Thank you very much. So, is there any question or other comment? Yeah, we see there.
Hello, my name is Tomáš Lindner. I'm a journalist from a Czech weekly paper called Respect. I'd like to ask, or Petra basically raised a topic which I consider crucial, which is the topic of youth employment. And I would basically have two questions. Like, is there any European project or policy in some region or country that from the previous 5 to 10 years that you would see as a good example of how to help create good quality jobs for young people on a mass scale? And the question I would not ask just to Petra, but to anybody who would like to answer in the floor. And the second question, which is related to it, is basically, is there a single or a few policies, particular specific policies, that you think Europe should change or reform or abolish to basically help create jobs for young people on a larger scale? Yeah? Basically, what Europe should focus on to deliver in this field. Thank you.
I start with the example of the project. I would say there are, in our experience, many examples, and if I should stick with some principles that are linked with those that are successful, is that job creation, in our humble experience, must be linked with governmental strategies and the priorities that were identified by the country and linked with the value chain opportunities. And the skills, employability skills and TVET or vocational education must be really market driven to make sure that there are enough job opportunities in the market. We had a number of successful projects like this in Ethiopia, but also in Zambia. And maybe Patience knows more exactly, more details about the TVET sector in Zambia. For example, very recently we have conducted this assessment in western province of Zambia, looking at the value chain, like what could be the market-driven TVET opportunities. And many of them are actually linked with honey, cassava, and pineapple, for example. And we could see that through the studies that potential of honey exportation is worth $25 million annually, just from these areas. So the potential is huge, and there are many youth that are trying to build that business already without having the access to financial institutions or some funding, to not always having access to skills or employment skills or job creation, and on how to create the small enterprise, how to link it to the transfer to markets and others. So if all this is combined based on the solid analysis linked with the governmental strategies and with the educational opportunities that the government can in long term support, because as was rightly said, we cannot replace the role of education.
Debt, but when it comes to debt is not bad, because the most indebted country in the world is Japan. But what matters for African countries is the nature of the debt, because African countries, most of the debt they have is from foreign funding. So if the African countries can have much of the debt from domestic debt, is better that way. So I think African countries need to focus more on domestic debt, which is easier to control and manipulate than external debt. Thank you.
Okay, just a quick remark about what regulations one would want to kind of see away with. I think that I would say that not necessarily see away with, but that actually that would be a context for discussion actually with African partners on how to frame the regulatory context for example, in the space of critical minerals, like what kind of, you mentioned the carbon tax, so And then there was this discussion of battery passport and the regulations, potentially that might arise from there. So I think that there's space for dialogue and co-shaping of the regulatory context, especially with increased partnerships along these critical mineral value chains, but also linking into to the agricultural sector in terms of photosanitary standards and the like, and how to make it easier in a way to work with.
Yeah, maybe also a very brief comment on the policy question. I think again, as the EU, we need to realize that it requires a fundamental change in the international division of labor, meaning that African societies and economies, also because of the demographic factor that was mentioned, they want to have decent jobs. They want to have a larger share of the value chain in their countries, and I think this must be a key priority. And we actually need to do much more in terms of incentivizing European firms to actually produce across Africa. Another policy change that we just have again recently seen the Chinese doing 3 weeks ago, they announced for all the African countries with which they have diplomatic relations, which is pretty much every country but Eswatini, they lowered the import duties for African goods to China down to 0, from one day to the other. We need to be honest again. Say again? Well, yeah, but at the same time, we are still negotiating economic partnership agreements with which some of the African counterparts are not so happy, right? So here again, I think we need to create economic opportunities, and obviously the Global Gateway tries that. The problem that I see is, and Ambassador Franca mentioned that, in the European context, and by the way, the US has a similar problem, we don't have the kind of state capitalism that China has. So we can't simply direct private corporations around and steer them and say, do this in Tanzania and do that in Katanga province. In the end of the day, it is decisions of private corporations, and this is again a huge risk actually in the context of the big promises that Global Gateway makes, whether we can actually, we meaning Europe and the EU, can actually back it up, because again, it's not that we can steer firms into ventures and into investments. It needs to make sense for them, economically speaking. But I'm obviously very much with patience that we need to involve again African stakeholders on how they want to reorganize their own economies. And I think we need something like an industrial interregionalism. What do I mean? We need to understand that for us in Europe to manage a transition towards net zero, a green transformation, we need partner regions, partner continents, and that means from the outset these partners should be given the opportunity to also define what they want from the corporation.
Thank you very much. You want to reflect on this?
Okay, yeah, just 2 things quickly. I think one thing regarding the policy is the EU could help strengthen the African Continental Free Trade Area. That is one area where I think there's been a lot of improvement in the last years since it's been signed, and I think 47 countries have ratified this now, and it's taking off. So this is the area where, even in terms of job creation and the likes, this could be an opportunity where the EU relationship could be strengthened. And the other one, someone mentioned the issue of civil societies in terms of some of them working for the government. I think the problem mostly is the problem of transitioning. There are not so many civil societies that were set up by the government to act on behalf of the government. But the problem with civil societies in Africa is when they achieve their aim and objectives, it's difficult for them to transition to other things. I did a study a couple of years ago, and I looked at civil society organizations that were set up to achieve or attain democracy. Once the country attains democracy or achieves democracy, what next? And then they become partisan because they don't want to just wind down and stop being functional. Many of them then become partisan and start working for the government. So assistance is needed for them in area of transition and moving on to from attaining democracy to sustaining democracy, in that example, or some other areas. And probably there needs to be regulations, although that is for the government to decide. But again, a lot of the problem is they get stuck and then they begin to look to the government for funding. And once the government begins to fund them, then they have to answer to the government.
Thank you. I don't want to take too long because I think we already took a lot, but maybe some reactions. Somebody said, how is global gateway, Professor Must, perceived in Africa? This is an issue. I said it in my initial intervention. There is a need for communication because it's a concept, an abstract, not abstract, but still to be fully delivered concept, a complex one, and we at the EU, we like acronyms and complex, and our competitors are way better at finding a buzzword with sometimes some manipulated information. In terms of Sahel, I don't want to be too long because I come from there, I'm too much into the subject. What I can say is that I think we have to depassionate that debate. That's why I referred in my initial introduction that it's not everywhere the same in Africa. I think Sahel, that narrative is way stronger than anywhere else. But I think, okay, there is a pushback saying we want sovereignty, we want respect, we want equals, okay. But once you've said that, and they say push your interests forward, and we do, and then we ask, and so what are yours? And that's where I didn't really get an answer yet. So I think we have to have a few years of thinking, each one of on its side, and then actually, because our interests, I don't want to say what are our interests in Africa because it's way too broad, and that's one of the things. I think Africa actually does not want to be called Africa. They are nations or countries. So, but at least in that area of Sahel that I know well, our interests as European Union, it's very easy. It's management of migratory flows, it's security at our borders, so fight against terrorism, it's population welfare to avoid a bit migration, and I would say it's anchorage to Europe, basically because we were the model and we feel we're not anymore, or not all the time. And so this is something that we want as the power or whatever to project an image and to be the model. And if we're not anymore, it's because something, or not completely, is because either we are making completely different choices, or we also have a problem of image, because actually when people live here, I think they are happy. But seen from outside, sometimes we have an image problem. On taxes, and this is also an issue of communication. We really have to step up our communication, but it's been years that we say that, and apparently we haven't found the right key as well, maybe because of a complicated history, as somebody said. But we have, like for 30 years, lowered our tariff rates to zero. We have the Everything But Arms initiative, where basically, of course, then we are complicated and burdensome, but we also have a domestic audience. I think issues of deforestation and carbon production actually matter our internal political opinion, and we also have to respond to them. But then when we have these issues, and I understand the criticism, although on CBAM, again, as somebody pointed out, we put a one-year period of adaptation. We are funding the adaptation. We are even now, again, slightly adjusting the size of the companies that actually have to, and of exports that have to respond to that. And it's a complicated issue. And what is true, and this is the argument I like the best, is that we did not warn them. We did our internal legislation and then, oops. So this has to be discussed. But the objective, I think, is laudable. we should care about these things. It's not, and then in terms of getting exports more difficult to partners, well, first, they don't pay taxes, customs, and then it's also how they want to position in the market, either being a high-end to export and then more added value, either for less maybe burdensome certification, but probably less added value. That's also one of the comments I had, which always makes me smile a bit, is that somebody asked about labor-intensive. Labor-intensive projects are usually the ones related to construction, roads, agriculture. Problem, it's not the ones that are the most transformational for economies. The more you transform the economy, the less it's labor-intensive. It's general, there are exceptions. The less it's labor-intensive, and then with the demographic index, it's always complicated when you actually design programs of development. Then, of course, somebody spoke of the times of COVID, and actually this is one of the Global Gateway flagships initiatives that we did. We actually created 3 or 4, or helped create vaccination centers in Africa, if my souvenirs are good. In South Africa, in Senegal, in Rwanda, I think I'm missing one. Anyway, in COVID itself, what was kind of these vaccination centers are producing something else, but all this vaccine, it was not perceived exactly the same way. I don't think that in Africa they were that eager to produce COVID vaccines, but what else did I think civil society, you came back, and thanks Tim for saying things the way I cannot say them about private sector and what we can or not. Civil society, the problem, to be very frank, is, somebody said it a bit like here, it's not even them being in politics. It's about civil society actually remaining civil, because the problem is that we fund it and then it cannot be, to be credible civil society, it cannot be a professional civil society. Professional in the sense that there is no occupation except for lobbying, and that is the hard thing to find, because indeed, I think it was you saying, they started with a fight, and then in the end they know how the public sector works. But then the independence and the difference between civil society and stakeholders, it's always hard to find, and so it's really a triptych between civil society, stakeholders and communities. And communities indeed are quite out of the system sometimes and quite hard to reach too. So it is an issue, but we try as much as we can. Yeah, I think those were the comments I had.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and one last, sorry, about critical raw materials and one issue we did not speak that much about, which is traceability, because we had that with mining of more conventional. The problem with critical raw materials is that we still want it to be a principled, at least if it's to export, a principled trade. The problem is about, and we noticed it with the recent crisis, the problem is traceability. As they are to be integrated in components, is way hard to find any mechanism to do it. It's something we're working on as well. And one last comment was about Erasmus as well, that's for youth, because we spoke a lot about youth. And the problem is that the proportion that actually go back. And we understand, because it's normal, people who feel well here to work here, but then the initial idea was to bring back experience to the home country, and the proportion actually going back is not huge to my knowledge. And yes, somebody also said that, of course, I mentioned China, but I don't think we should be, that it should be necessarily a battleground. We have different approach, different offer, but I did not make my whole speech about that. But of course, African partners, and it is normal, I said it in the beginning, more assertive, so they are kind of marketing us, it's normal, putting us on the market. And this is competition, we always as EU advocated for competition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can take it as concluding remarks, because unfortunately the time has run out, and it's also not healthy to sit for long. So we have to stand up and do some exercise. So thank you very much for coming. I think it's always a great opportunity to meet some policymakers and different stakeholders. In the morning there was a forum organized by the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, actually focusing on the Sahel region. So we are happy that we could have organized another forum with another type of politician, representative of the European Union. And there was also, I'm sorry, I also missed that there was also a forum organized by the Czech NGOs, which were also discussing what kind of activities they do in Africa. It was earlier in the morning. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for making the efforts to make it to Prague. I hope your stay in Prague will be much more pleasant than the journey to Prague. And I would like to invite all of you for the small refreshment that is waiting for you outside of the room. So please help yourself and use it as a chance for some networking. So thank you very much once again, and hopefully see you some other time. Thank you.